Hello. Can you please introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Janice Williams. I'm the head of sixth form at Haileybury, Almaty. I'm also a teacher of biology and physics sometimes. And before I was a teacher, I was what's called a clinical physiologist in a hospital system in the UK. And I did research and hospital-based work measuring things.
Okay. What is the primary function of the nervous system in the human body?
Well, it depends at what level you're answering the question. So if we're answering the question just for younger students, the main purpose of the nervous system is really all about protection and control. And what we mean by control is controlling all of the functions of the body. So that's primarily what the nervous system is doing. It's controlling everything that you do when you walk, how fast your heart beats, which muscles work, when you breathe, etc., etc. Every single thing that happens in your body is controlled by the nervous system.
What are the two main divisions of the human nervous system and what are their functions?
Again, quite simple without getting into too much detail. So there are two divisions, one called the central nervous system, and unsurprisingly that's in the centre, i.e. the brain and the spinal cord. And then there is the peripheral nervous system, which it branches out from the central nervous system on the periphery. So the central nervous system is involved in processing information that comes into it from neurons, and then it sends information to the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system is going to do something with that information. So it might move a limb, or it might contract a muscle, or it might make a gland secrete. So the central nervous system's in charge of gathering in all the information and then sending instructions to the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system carries out those instructions.
What's a synapse?
A synapse is where two neurons meet, and if you think of it, it's a little bit like two roads meeting, and then there's a gap between the two. So, if people wanted to cross that gap, they would have a number of options. They could go over a bridge, or they could run through the traffic, or they could jump. And that's basically what happens. We've got to get information from one neuron to the next neuron. And it's how does that happen? So a synapse is a junction between two neurons, and neurons are the cells of the nervous system that carry the information. So it's a gap.
Mm-hmm. How do neurons transmit signals, and what's their role?
Well, they transmit signals electrically. So down one neuron, you'd get an electrical signal, and that electrical signal has to be passed on to the next neuron, but that can't be done by the electrical signal jumping. So this is where the electrical signals and chemical messengers join together. So in a synapse, you have small membrane-bound pockets called vesicles, and inside a vesicle are substances called neurotransmitters, and they do exactly what it says on the tin. They are a way of transmitting neuronal information, neurotransmitters. So these vesicles, when an electrical impulse meets them, they start to migrate towards the end of the neuron, and then they merge with the membrane of the neuron, and they spill out into the synapse, into the gap. And then by the process of diffusion, they move quite quickly across the synapse, and then they meet receptors on what we call the postsynaptic membrane, which is just the next membrane of the next neuron, but it's after the synapse. And the neurotransmitters meet the receptors, and then that causes the electrical impulse to pass down along the next neuron.
Can you name some neurotransmitters?
There are some called, the most common ones, acetylcholine is probably the most common one, and noradrenaline is another one. A lot of people have heard of adrenaline. Noradrenaline is slightly different. It's not always the case, but acetylcholine tends to cause stimulatory responses at synapse, and noradrenaline inhibitory responses, but that's not always true. That's a very big generalization.
What are some common neurological disorders, and how do they affect people?
Gosh, there are loads. I actually did my master's dissertation on Alzheimer's disease, and Alzheimer's disease causes, as I'm sure many of you will know, a general degeneration of a human being. So it can be slow, or it can be quite aggressive and be very quick. It can start young, and it can start at an older age. So some people in their mid-40s to early 50s can get Alzheimer's disease, but also people in their 70s and 80s. There are a field of scientists that believe if people live old enough, i.e. if everyone lived till 100, everyone would inevitably get Alzheimer's disease. And what Alzheimer's disease is the laying down of abnormal molecules in your brain, so things called amyloid plaques and these strange structures which like little balls of wool called neurofibrillary tangles form in your brain, and they basically destroy your brain. So things that you can do without any thought at all, talking, vision, cognitive processes, making sense of things, you start to lose the ability to do those. So neurological disorders, most of them are really debilitating and really sad. But very quirky. There's one that's not so debilitating, which you may have heard of, called synesthesia. And in that disorder, people will taste colours. So if they hear the word orange, they will get a certain taste in their mouth, or they see numbers in patterns, or they see numbers as colours. So a number 7 might be yellow, and they identify very differently. Their senses seem to be interlinked or mixed up. That's an interesting one. There's also a condition, a really, really rare, called fatal familial sleep disorder, and it actually kills people, and it runs in families, it's genetic, but what happens is the people cannot go to sleep. And you might think, no, that's not that bad and it wouldn't kill you, but actually it causes the death of people. They lose their ability to move properly. It's an absolutely devastating disorder. Fortunately, it's very, very rare. And then there's one that probably a lot of people have heard of, which is Parkinson's disorder, and that's very much a disorder that relates to the movement of the patient or the individual. And when you're talking to somebody with Parkinson's disorder, even if they're not moving, you might notice that they have very limited facial expression, or their eyes don't move, and it's because it is a disorder of movement of the muscles. So they may have a very, very sort of monotone voice, or a very sort of dull expression. But that, again, is a degenerative disorder and has a very sad outcome for patients.
What happens in our brain during stress response?
Well, you release a substance called cortisol. What cortisol does is it's a chemical that's released to help us deal with stress. And one of the things it does is it automatically converts, well, it sends a message to convert glycogen in our liver to glucose in our bloodstream. So it raises the amount of glucose available in your blood. And all of the biology students will know that if you've got more glucose going to cells, then cells are able to respire more readily, and that means they're able to release more energy. And if you've got more energy, you're able to do things like contract your muscles more effectively or breathe more rapidly, and then you would be able to, I don't know, run away from a beast. So the stress response is a sort of primeval response that we still have. So you might find things like before an exam for you guys, or before an interview, I might get what I would class as a stress response, which is linked back to the cave days when I'd have to run away from a huge predator. I still have that response now, but I don't have to run away from predators anymore. It's more dealing with interviews, or you guys dealing with exams.
How do drugs affect our nervous system?
So it depends whether you meant medical drugs like targeted chemotherapy, or drugs that help with inflammation, or drugs that are recreational drugs. So I'm guessing we're thinking about recreational drugs, and they basically work by normally getting involved at synapses. And if you remember from what we said before, synapse is a gap between a neuron, between two neurons. So a message has to get from one side of the gap to the other side of the gap, and to do that it sends chemicals to receptors. So there are drugs that can actually act like a neurotransmitter, and they can fit into the receptors and cause a response. There are also drugs that can sit inside the receptors and inhibit a response, and there are drugs that can get into the synapse and stop a neurotransmitter from being taken back up. That's a normal thing that would happen. A neurotransmitter would go into a receptor, and then another chemical would start to break that neurotransmitter down so that you didn't get a sustained response. But if we've got a drug that can stop that neurotransmitter being taken up or degraded, then the response could continue. So if you had a neurotransmitter that made you feel good momentarily, but then you had a drug that stopped that neurotransmitter being taken away, you can prolong feeling good. And all drugs act in different ways. Heroin, MDMA, cannabis, they all do different things, but they generally are operating at a nerve synapse.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.